What would you do if you matched with someone online who seemed perfect, only to discover they weren't who they claimed to be? This Christmas, a simple swipe on a dating app turned into a night that changed my life forever. It started as a harmless distraction, scrolling through profiles while the snow fell outside my grandparents' cozy house. And then he appeared. His profile name? Santa Claus. His bio? Spreading Christmas cheer one date at a time. At 30 years old, he seemed charming, witty, and maybe a little cheeky. After a few flirty messages, I agreed to meet him for a late-night Christmas Eve coffee. But nothing could have prepared me for what I saw when I walked into that cafe. This is a story about unexpected connections, the secrets people hide, and how one Christmas taught me that loneliness is a burden we all share, no matter our age. The snow was falling steadily outside the frost-covered windows of my grandparents' house. It was Christmas Eve, and I should have been feeling festive, surrounded by the familiar hum of holiday traditions. My grandma was bustling in the kitchen. My younger cousins were chasing each other around the tree, and my grandpa was snoring loudly in his armchair by the fire. Yet, I felt oddly disconnected. I pulled out my phone, scrolling mindlessly through my dating app. I wasn't looking for anything serious, just a way to pass the time. Profile after profile blurred together until one stood out. The name, Santa Claus. The bio, spreading Christmas cheer one date at a time. I chuckled, intrigued. His photos showed a man who was classically handsome. Salt and pepper beard, sparkling green eyes, and a warm smile that made me feel like I was in a Hallmark movie. According to his profile, he was 30, lived nearby, and was always in the mood for holiday magic. Corny? Absolutely. But somehow, it worked. I swiped right, and to my surprise, it was an instant match. A message popped up almost immediately. Ho, 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 ho. Looks like someone's on Santa's nice list this year. Rolling my eyes at his cheesy opening line, I decided to play along. And what exactly does Santa have in store for me? I replied. The conversation flowed effortlessly. He was witty, charming, and seemed genuinely interested in me. Within an hour, he suggested we meet for coffee at a cozy cafe just a few blocks from my grandparents' house. I know it's last minute, he wrote, but Christmas Eve is all about surprises, right? Part of me hesitated. Meeting someone on Christmas Eve felt impulsive, but another part of me, the restless, curious part, couldn't resist. All right, Santa, I typed back. Let's see if you're as magical in person as you are online. The cafe was small and quaint, with warm lights strung along the windows and the scent of cinnamon wafting through the air. I arrived a few minutes early, my nerves buzzing as I scanned the room for a familiar face. But there was no one who looked like the man from the photos. Instead, sitting at a corner table was an older man, much older. He must have been at least 70. His hair was stark white, his face lined with years of life, and his posture slightly hunched. He wore a red sweater and glasses perched on his nose. For a moment, I assumed it was a coincidence. Maybe he was just here to enjoy a quiet coffee on Christmas Eve. But then he waved at me. My stomach dropped. I froze, my mind racing. This couldn't be him. There had to be some mistake. The man stood, smiling nervously, and approached me. "Are you Alex?" he asked, his voice soft but steady. I blinked, unsure how to respond. Yeah, I managed. "I'm Henry," he said, extending his hand. "Or, as you know me, Santa Claus." For a moment, I was frozen in place, my mind scrambling to process what was happening. This man, this much older man, was standing in front of me, claiming to be Santa Claus, the charming 30-year-old I'd been chatting with online. It felt like some kind of prank, like hidden cameras would suddenly appear and I'd hear laughter echoing in the background. But there was no laughter, just the soft hum of Christmas music playing in the cafe and the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I forced a polite smile, trying to mask my shock. Hi, I stammered, shaking his hand. His grip was firm, his hands calloused, as if he'd spent a lifetime working with them. Thank you for meeting me, he said warmly. I wasn't sure if you'd show up. I wanted to blurt out. Of course I showed up. I thought you were someone else, but I bit my tongue. Instead, I gestured awkwardly toward the table he'd been sitting at. Should we sit? He nodded, leading me back to the corner table. As we settled into our seats, I couldn't help but glance around, hoping no one else had noticed the strange dynamic unfolding. You seem surprised, Henry said, breaking the silence. His eyes twinkled, not with the flirtatious charm I remembered from the app, but with a quiet wisdom that made me feel both uneasy and intrigued. Well, you don't exactly look like your photos, I said, trying to keep my tone light. It was an understatement, but I didn't want to come off as rude. Henry sighed, folding his hands on the table. I suppose I owe you an explanation, he began. You think? The words slipped out before I could stop them. I immediately felt a pang of guilt. His expression didn't falter, though. Instead, he nodded, as if he'd expected my reaction. Alex, he said, leaning forward slightly, I wasn't entirely honest on my profile. The photos, the age. It wasn't me. But I promise you, my intentions were never to deceive you in a harmful way. I stared at him, a mixture of frustration and curiosity bubbling inside me. Then what were your intentions, Henry? Because this feels, well, it feels a little messed up. He winced, and for the first time, I noticed the vulnerability in his eyes. You're right. It is messed up, and I'm sorry. I didn't know how else to connect with someone. I frowned, confused. What do you mean? Henry took a deep breath, his gaze dropping to the table. I'm 70 years old, Alex. I live alone. My wife passed away 5 years ago, and my children, well, they're busy with their own lives. I spend most of my days in an empty house, surrounded by memories. And the holidays, they're the hardest. His voice cracked slightly, and I felt my irritation begin to waver. He looked back up at me, his eyes pleading for understanding. I know what I did was wrong, but I wasn't trying to hurt anyone. I just wanted to feel noticed, wanted, even if it was just for a little while. I didn't know what to say. Part of me was still angry that he'd lied, angry that I'd been tricked. But another part of me, the empathetic part, couldn't ignore the raw honesty in his words. So, you created this whole persona? I asked, my tone softer now. Why not just be yourself? Henry chuckled bitterly. Do you think anyone would swipe right on a profile that says 70-year-old widower looking for companionship? People my age don't use these apps. And younger people, well, they wouldn't give me a second glance. Pretending to be someone else felt like the only way. His words hit me harder than I expected. I thought about my own reasons for being on the app. How I'd been searching for a connection to fill the emptiness I felt that night. Maybe Henry and I weren't so different after all. I don't know what to say, I admitted after a long pause. This is a lot to process. Henry nodded, his expression tinged with regret. I understand if you want to leave. I won't stop you. But if you do, just know that I'm truly sorry for misleading you. I sat there, staring at the man in front of me. He wasn't the person I'd been expecting, but he was a person nonetheless. Flawed, lonely, and just trying to navigate the same messy world we all lived in. For reasons I couldn't fully explain, I stayed. Henry's words hung in the air, heavy with vulnerability. I took a deep breath, my fingers tracing the rim of the coffee cup in front of me. Part of me wanted to walk out, to leave this unexpected and uncomfortable situation behind. But another part, the part that felt an odd tug of empathy, kept me rooted in my seat. You're right, I finally said. This is a lot to process, but I'm still here, so let's talk. A flicker of relief crossed Henry's face, and for the first time, his smile didn't seem tinged with nervousness or regret. It was soft, genuine, and oddly comforting. Thank you, he said. You didn't have to stay, but it means a lot that you did. I shrugged, trying to play it cool, even though my heart was still racing. So, Henry, I began, leaning back in my chair. What exactly were you hoping to get out of tonight? He hesitated, his hands clasped tightly together on the table. Honestly, just a conversation, someone to talk to. The holidays can feel unbearable when you're alone. His eyes met mine, filled with a quiet sadness. I wasn't expecting anything beyond that. I studied him for a moment, trying to reconcile the man sitting in front of me with the confident, flirtatious Santa Claus I'd been messaging earlier. It was hard not to feel sympathy for him. Loneliness wasn't something I'd experienced often, but I could see how it might drive someone to do things they wouldn't normally do. Well, you've got me here, I said, my tone softening. So, tell me about yourself, the real you. Henry blinked, clearly caught off guard. You want to know about me? Yeah, I said with a small smile. I mean, I already know you're 70, you hate being alone, and you've got a thing for playing Santa Claus online. What else is there? He chuckled, the sound light and genuine, and for a moment, it felt like the tension between us eased. All right, he said, leaning back in his chair. I'm a retired carpenter. Spent most of my life building homes, fixing things. You name it. I've got 2 kids, both grown, and a golden retriever named Max, who thinks he owns the house. Sounds like a good life, I said, genuinely curious. What happened? His smile faded, and he looked down at his hands. It was. But when my wife passed, everything changed. The house felt empty. My kids stopped visiting as much, and I started feeling like I didn't matter anymore. Like I'd been left behind. His words hit me harder than I expected. I thought about how I'd been feeling that night. Disconnected, restless, searching for something to fill the void. Maybe we weren't so different after all. That sounds really hard, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Henry nodded. It is. But you didn't come here to listen to an old man's sob story. Maybe not, I admitted. But I'm here now. For the next hour, we talked. Really talked. Henry shared stories about his life, his career, his family, the love he'd lost. And I found myself opening up in ways I hadn't expected. I told him about my struggles with feeling like I didn't belong, about how I'd been aimlessly scrolling through the app that night, hoping to find a connection. By the time the cafe staff started clearing tables for closing, I realized I didn't want the conversation to end. The cafe's cozy atmosphere had grown quieter as the evening wore on, the last few patrons leaving one by one. Henry and I remained at our corner table, the conversation flowing in a way that felt natural, yet unexpected. I'd come here with one version of tonight in mind, but what I was getting was entirely different and strangely meaningful. As the waitress came by to collect our empty cups, Henry glanced at his watch. "It's getting late," he said, a hint of reluctance in his voice. "I should probably let you go." I hesitated, the thought of leaving weighing heavier than I anticipated. "You don't have to," I said, surprising even myself. "I mean, unless you've got some elves to check on or reindeer to feed." Henry laughed, a deep, warm sound that seemed to erase the awkwardness that had lingered earlier. "No elves? No reindeer?" he said, shaking his head. "Just me and Max back at home. But I'll take that as a compliment. At least my Santa act wasn't a total failure." "It wasn't," I admitted. "I mean, the deception part, not great. But the conversation, unexpectedly nice." He looked at me, his expression softening. "You know, Alex, you're a lot kinder than I probably deserve. Most people would have walked out the second they saw me." I shrugged, feeling a bit self-conscious under his gaze. "I guess I just get it." The loneliness, I mean. It's not easy, no matter how old you are. Henry's smile faltered, replaced by a look of quiet gratitude. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely audible, "for giving me this chance." As the cafe staff began dimming the lights, signaling it was time to go, I stood, unsure how to wrap up the night. This wasn't exactly the kind of first date I'd imagined when I swiped right on his profile, but it was something else, something that felt significant in a way I couldn't quite explain. Outside, the snow had blanketed the streets in a thick, untouched layer. The air was crisp, and my breath puffed out in soft clouds as we stepped onto the sidewalk. Henry stood beside me, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his red sweater. "Well," he said after a long pause, "I guess this is where we part ways." I hesitated, glancing at him. He looked so small against the backdrop of the snowy street, his shoulders slightly hunched and his eyes cast downward. Something about the sight tugged at me. "You said you live nearby, right?" I asked. He nodded. "Just a few blocks that way." He gestured vaguely down the road. "Why? Would you mind if I walked with you?" The words came out before I'd fully thought them through, but I didn't regret them. The idea of letting him walk home alone felt wrong. Henry's eyes widened slightly, and for a moment, he looked like he might refuse. But then he nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. I'd like that. We walked in comfortable silence, the snow crunching underfoot as we made our way through the quiet streets. The houses around us were decorated with twinkling lights, their windows glowing warmly. It felt like a scene from a Christmas card, surreal and serene. The snow seemed to absorb the world's sounds, leaving only the rhythmic crunch of our footsteps. The silence between Henry and me was not awkward, but contemplative, as if we both knew words couldn't quite capture the strange connection forming between us. Henry stopped in front of a modest single-story home with a wraparound porch. Strings of colorful Christmas lights hung along the eaves, glowing softly against the dark sky. It wasn't overly festive, but it carried a quiet charm that matched the man standing next to me. "This is me," Henry said, gesturing toward the house. He hesitated, his breath visible in the cold air. "Thank you for walking me home, Alex. I didn't expect tonight to turn out like this." Neither did I admitted, glancing at him. Something about the vulnerability in his expression made me want to say more, but I wasn't sure what. Would you... His voice trailed off as he shifted nervously. Would you like to come in for a bit? I mean, only if you're comfortable. Max would love the company. I smiled at the mention of his dog. Sure, I said, surprising even myself. I'd like that. Henry's face lit up and he quickly unlocked the door. As soon as we stepped inside, a golden retriever bounded toward us, tail wagging furiously. Henry knelt down, scratching behind the dog's ears. This is Max, he said with a grin, my loyal companion. Hi, Max, I said, crouching to pet him. The dog responded enthusiastically, leaning into my touch. He's great. Yeah, Henry said, his voice tinged with affection. He's gotten me through some tough times. As I stood, I took in the living room. It was cozy and filled with personal touches. A well-worn armchair near the fireplace, framed photos on the mantel, and a small Christmas tree decorated with handmade ornaments. It felt lived in, warm, but also lonely. Henry motioned toward the couch. Make yourself comfortable. Can I get you something? Coffee? Tea? Tea sounds nice, I replied, settling onto the couch. Max immediately flopped onto the floor next to me, resting his head on my feet. While Henry busied himself in the kitchen, I studied the photos on the mantel. There were pictures of him with a woman I assumed was his late wife, as well as 2 younger adults. His children, most likely. They looked happy, content. It was hard to reconcile those images with the man I'd met tonight, who seemed so weighed down by loss and solitude. When Henry returned with 2 steaming mugs of tea, he noticed where my gaze had lingered. That's my family, he said, his voice soft as he handed me a mug. My wife, Margaret, and our kids, David and Emily. They look happy, I said, unsure what else to say. They were, he said, sitting across from me. We all were, but time changes things. Margaret's gone, and David and Emily, well, they have their own lives now. They visit when they can, but it's not the same. I nodded, letting his words sink in. That must be hard. It is, he admitted, especially during the holidays. I used to love Christmas. Margaret and I would decorate the house, bake cookies, host these big family dinners. Now, it just feels hollow. I looked at him, the raw emotion in his voice cutting through me. Is that why you created the profile? I asked gently. To try and fill that void? He nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the mug in his hands. I thought, if I could connect with someone, even just for a night, it might make things a little less lonely. But I didn't think anyone would want to meet the real me. So I pretended. His honesty hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't just his age or his situation that struck me. It was the fact that, deep down, I understood. Loneliness was universal, and in some ways, we were both searching for the same thing. I'm not saying it was the right thing to do, Henry continued, his voice barely above a whisper, but I didn't know how else to reach out. I sipped my tea, letting the warmth spread through me as I thought about what to say. You didn't have to pretend, you know, I said finally. You're not as invisible as you think you are. Henry looked up at me, his eyes wide with surprise. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the crackle of the fireplace and Max's gentle snoring at my feet. The silence between us felt heavy, yet comforting. Henry's eyes searched mine, and for the first time that night, I saw a spark of hope. You really mean that? He asked softly. I nodded. Yeah, I do. You're not invisible, Henry. You shouldn't feel like you have to be someone else to matter. His lips curved into a tentative smile, the weight of his earlier confession seeming to lift just a little. Thank you, Alex. You don't know what that means to me. As the fire crackled softly, I felt something shift, a quiet understanding passing between us. We were two people, separated by decades of life experience, but connected by the same human need: to be seen, to be understood, to matter. Sometimes, I said, breaking the silence, the best connections happen when you least expect them. Henry nodded, his expression thoughtful. You've given me more than I could have asked for tonight, more than I thought I deserved. The next morning, Christmas Day, dawned bright and clear. Snow glittered on the ground, and the world felt fresh, renewed. As I sat with my family unwrapping presents and sipping hot cocoa, my thoughts kept drifting back to Henry. A small smile crept across my face as I pulled out my phone and sent him a message. Merry Christmas, Henry. Thanks for reminding me what this season is really about. Seconds later, his reply came through. Merry Christmas, Alex. And thank you for giving an old man a reason to believe in the magic again. That Christmas, I realized that sometimes the most unexpected moments, like matching with Santa Claus, can lead to the connections we need most. And while Henry and I would never be more than friends, we'd given each other a gift that mattered: understanding, and the hope that neither of us would face the holidays alone again.